Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. So, John, we left Paul living by himself in Rome with a soldier guarding him. So he's made it to Rome. He's made it, as we said in the last episode, with some good reputation in place that he's been allowed to, and as we said, living by himself probably means more he's in control of where he's living. Let's not try and imagine Paul in a nice Roman bachelor pad just with the Roman soldiers stood by the door.
Absolutely. Yes. No, I think it seems to me that he's being given some special privilege where he's not necessarily. Now I can hear echo.
You can, right? Okay.
I can. So I can hear my voice echoing, so I didn't want that in case that was coming on the recording.
Yeah. So can you hold your thought in mind?
Yeah, so I think what's really wonderful here is that we're seeing, you reflected last time brilliantly as we closed our podcast on the fact that Paul was trusted. And I think Paul is being entrusted that though he's technically still under arrest and he still has to appear before Caesar, he's trusted to behave well and respectfully. And again, I all the evidence of what we read in the last few verses of the book of Acts seems to absolutely affirm that. And of course, what's fascinating is one of the first things he's doing, although we're going to read it now, he's reaching out to the Jewish community, not just to the followers of Jesus community. So it's very interesting that he takes advantage of this house that he's in, but he does it seemingly carefully and respectfully so as not to lose the privilege that he has.
Yes. So we're going to read from verse 17 of Acts 28 down through to about verse 22 here for today, as we get into just the last few verses of this 3-year journey that we've taken through the book of Acts.
I know. We've taken longer to get to Rome than Paul did. So yeah, it's like, come on. We're jet lagged. Probably our listeners are jet lagged as well. When are you going to hurry up? Get to the end. We're almost there, listeners. We're almost there. So yeah. Do you want me to read this?
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. So it says this: 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul told them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and to talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain." They replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there have reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking about this sect."
There we go. It's interesting because it feels remarkable. This little conversation does. There's almost an unbelievable level of like we haven't heard anything.
Yeah,
it's like, wow, okay. But let's get to that in just a minute. I think it's interesting just to jump right in. You made this comment before you started to read. that Paul's way of being is continuing here. He's calling together. He's actually, it's synagogue practice. I mean, he calls together the local Jewish leaders, and he wants to talk carefully with them. And you can see the sense that they're in Rome. There's probably some tension. I mean, I know from research for other contexts that there's a lot of evidence that Jewish people in Rome were very conscious of not triggering Roman ire. Jewish people in Rome were given, it seems at some point around here, I want to be careful of not being anachronistic, but Jewish people were given certain freedoms to not participate in certain Roman practices. And it does seem that one of the tensions amongst the early Christians that develops from here is that the Romans thought of the early Christians as Jews, even though the Jews said, no, there's Gentiles amongst them. And it does seem that there's some theories out there that the Jewish people who were Christians welcoming Gentile people to be also Christians could have inadvertently suggested to Rome that Jewish people were kind of hiding tax evaders and honor evaders in their midst, right? Because, well, if Jewish people are easily identified by certain practices such as circumcision, and now you've got what appears to be a Jewish group having uncircumcised people amongst it, this is really complex. So some scholars have theorized that this is one of the tensions that's going on, that the Jewish communities are nervous that the Christians are going to cost them their protections. And I think you feel this in this text a little bit, that they're all aware of the fact that this conversation that we're having here cannot develop into a riot like it has done in other places. So there's more, it feels like there's more politicking going on in this one.
Yeah, completely. There's more at stake.
Yes.
I think, absolutely. And, Paul's a smart man. He would be foolish considering his own position as a prisoner, though he's been given special privileges. He's still a prisoner, and he still has to stand before Caesar. He would be foolish to unnecessarily antagonize either the Romans or the Jewish community, or antagonize the Romans by antagonizing the Jewish community. So this is just really sensible behavior. And I think, of course, it's also in line with Paul's own missiology as well. I think there's a real sensible social dynamic to this conversation. He's wanting to make contacts with the local and influential Jewish community. So he wants to do that. That's his, that's just a good idea. But also we've seen the missional pattern through the book of Acts, where Paul has, where possible, gone to Jewish synagogues or Jewish communities first. And then if they weren't present, he would go, for example, like Philippi, to the place of prayer, or they would go to the Jewish synagogue and then go on and meet with Gentiles. So this doesn't feel out of step. But of course, what you do feel is there's an extra layer of weight to this conversation, because Paul doesn't want to set off some sort of incendiary device and draw unnecessary attention both to himself or to his Jewish brothers. I mean, I love the language, brothers. He refers to them not as Jewish people, but as brothers. And again, this shows Paul's affinity with Israel, Paul's affinity with his own people, which of course comes across beautifully, ironically and gloriously, in the actual book that we call Romans. There's some incredible statements from Paul about his passion for Israel and his desire to see Israel saved. So this is all in a pattern. It's a missiological pattern that Paul has been following. And I just love I love the little throwaway comment. Again, this is Dr. Luke's details. Three days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. And I just love the sense, the wisdom of Paul. He gets himself settled. He gets to understand the lay of the land. He's probably finding out what is what. And then let's take a breath, and then let's meet with these guys, rather than rushing or delaying unnecessarily. And it feels like, there's something very intentional and deliberate about Paul's 3-day break to prepare him to meet with these Jewish leaders in Rome. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, this opening statement is very classically Paul from what we know as well. My brothers, I have done nothing against the traditions of the fathers, right? It's translated ancestors here. But this notion of the traditions we see so often in kind of New Testament conversation, and I have done not one thing against that. And so he's really holding that position well. And it's interesting that Luke shows us that this is still a point that Paul really wants to make. He really wants people to grasp this, and I think it's significant actually that at some level this document that we call Acts is amongst the many things that it's doing, it's working as almost an apology, and I don't mean a saying sorry, but I mean an apologetic for Paul. That right through to the very end, Paul is adamant on this point that he has not done anything that actually violates Jewish customs, and this is actually a significant theological point for the early church as well, isn't it?
It is, and I was thinking the same thing as you were, reflecting that the book of Acts runs as an apologetic not only to the Gentile world, to the Roman world, but of course to an open-hearted Jewish person who's trying to understand this new sect, trying to understand what's going on. Paul is trying to remove any unnecessary barriers. So he's trying to show them, look, I haven't set out to hurt our people. I haven't set out to violate the law. I haven't set out to dishonor Moses. I've tried, to follow the ways of Torah. But of course, he's introducing Jesus as the fulfillment of Torah. So again, the book of Acts is sometimes seen as this drive towards the Gentile world. And of course, ultimately it is, as we reflected last time, from Jerusalem to Rome, from temple to house, from Jewish epicenter to Gentile epicenter. Yeah, that's all going on in the Luke Acts corpus. But we must not ignore Paul's desire to see his own people engage with Jesus Messiah. He wants them to know that Jesus is Messiah. And he wants them to know that holding Jesus as Messiah doesn't mean they have to violate the Torah itself.
Yeah.
I mean, within the whole of Judaism, there would be multiple different opinions on how certain things are done and how certain things should be practiced. But in terms of an understanding of the integrity of Torah itself and Tanakh, Paul is saying, I haven't violated this. I've held the line on this, and I want you to be assured that I'm not some sort of weird maverick troublemaker.
Yes.
But that I actually have a heart for Torah and Tanakh. So yeah, I think it's an important double-edged apologetic in the book of Acts.
And like you say, even this point that when he then in verse 19, like the Romans wanted to release me. I'm not deserving of death. The objection was made at my release, so I appealed to Caesar, but not to bring a charge against my own people. Yeah. Just basically to avoid the death penalty, essentially. So you're actually, I think this is quite an important sentence that he wants them to know. I'm not here in Rome to make trouble for you, right? Because I do wonder sometimes, and this is just my own kind of academic reflections, but if the earlier concerns that I listed, that some scholars wonder about, if they're correct, is there a fear amongst the Jewish people that if this guy turns up and immediately preaches this message of the inclusion of Jew and Gentile and therefore removes the boundaries, this might have immense social impact for us in Rome? Because all of a sudden, as we do see with later Christians, the protection of Judaism is taken from them, so they are expected to offer the various sacrifices and temple taxes and so on and so forth. And we end up in that 2nd century martyrdom traditions that happen. So So there is potentially a fear that how Paul's going to get out of this is he's going to throw us under the bus and claim that the natural progression of Israel is this inclusive welcome that we saw in Cornelius, that we saw it, and so on and so forth. So you can understand why he's saying here, like, it's not my intent to bring a charge against my own people. This is probably quite significant. And then you get this stunning line. It is because of the hope of Israel that I'm bound with this chain.
Wow. Yeah, incredible, isn't it? You know, so, and what's fascinating, of course, in this introductory conversation is that explicitly Jesus isn't mentioned yet.
Yes.
Now, I mean, it may well have happened in terms of the detail. I mean, you know, we're given a couple of paragraphs, a couple of verses in Acts 28 that probably summarizes quite an intensive meeting, first meeting.
Yes.
First of a number. So the conversation about Yeshua, Jesus, Messiah, may well have come up, but at this point, he's positioning himself very much as a Jewish person. Now, they are clearly aware of what he represents, because that's coming in a moment, you know, in terms of this sect. So they are clearly aware that there's some sort of sect that's split off from Judaism that Paul needs to explain himself over. So that's there. But Paul is very much positioning himself into the mainstream Jewish community. And I mean, this phrase, it is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with chains, is just absolutely remarkable in terms of how he understands then who he is and what he is actually doing here in this context. Amazing.
Well, he's offering us a reading of Old Testament that we know that Paul holds, but it's not lost to me that if any of our listeners actually have their Bible open in front of them, they can probably see Romans. Generally at this point, you're so close, but at the end of Acts, the next page is Romans at very least, if not the same page. And you're going to see Paul unpack this story from Abraham to Jesus. So, I mean, this is a very core Pauline idea. And in fact, it drew me back to just a couple of chapters ago in chapter 26 in verse 6. You know, Paul says this: "It is now because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today." So this is a theme we've seen in Acts already as well, that Paul really does see that Paul's not a rupturist. He doesn't think that Jesus has changed the arc of the Old Testament. The Old Testament has always been heading to Jesus in Paul's mind.
Absolutely.
And actually, I think this is really important for us, particularly even just as we, the church, think about how we relate so often to the Old Testament and all that. A lot of people will have been exposed to sermons and ideas that actually say something quite different from what we say. We hear Paul saying here. So, I mean, you must have heard this, John, at some point in your life. People will talk about the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. Which is deeply heretical. The creeds of the church would be really worried about a statement like that. But I realize that the reason we start to talk like that is because we've not often wrestled with what Paul has wrestled with to make a statement like this, to be able to see how the story of God flows from Eden right the way through to the cross and resurrection, and then carrying on to what we see in Revelation. And I don't think Paul makes sense if we read him like we've tended to do in the modern world, where it was like almost everything up to Jesus is almost just there to show us what not to do. And then Jesus comes along, and now we have a better example of what we're supposed to do going forward. That's just not how the early church read the Bible, is it?
Yeah, and it seems to me, and these are dangerous concepts and emotive language, but it seems to me with this language, Paul is not seeing the ecclesia as the replacement of Israel, but he sees the ecclesia as the enlargement, the expansion,
Yes.
the
The hope.
ultimate, the hope of Israel. So you get this beautiful language that we've explored before, where Paul, especially in Ephesians, talks about, the peace of Jesus, the shalom of the Lord, making the two men one.
Yes.
And forming a new temple, forming something that is truly inclusive of this. And I love this. And of course, the tragedy is that as time went on, that idea became more and more fractured and drifted further and further apart to the extent that probably for a modern Jewish person, the idea that early Christians thought like this would probably blow their brains, blow their mind. What do you mean that the early church positioned itself fundamentally within the understanding of the hope of God for Israel? So you get this incredible. Paul is an advocate, and he's sitting now in the heart of Rome, but he's talking about being in chains because of the hope of Israel. So he's making sure, and the fact that Luke records this, Luke wants us to understand that just because we're now in Rome and we're in the house and we're surrounded by Gentiles, doesn't mean that the beginning of the story is to be ignored. In fact, this ending of the story, as far as the book of Acts is concerned, is actually about keeping the whole story connected. It's about ensuring that whatever the Gentiles get to enjoy, it is because of the root and, as it were, the foundation of Israel, the hope of Israel, that Jesus, the Messiah for Israel, is the Messiah for the world. And that Paul positions himself dynamically within that. And I think, I want to be a person that wrestles with that and understands that and doesn't simply see my Gentile version of my experience as exclusive or other or different or even better, but that actually I see what I'm experiencing today as the ultimate fulfillment of the biblical story that starts way back when and moves through the text relentlessly as the hope of Israel and the hope of the world. And back to our little, one of my favorite little passages, the two on the road to Emmaus. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And of course he did, but in a way that they did not expect, in a way they did not probably struggle to understand, and maybe still struggle to understand. But Paul is unashamed of this redemption story, but trying to keep it positioned very much at the epicenter of Israel's hope.
I was just looking back, trying to think about even just what's shaping Paul scripturally on this, and so just to help people join some of those dots, like if we turn back in our Bibles to Isaiah and to chapter 2, I mean, listen to this. If I can read this, John, it's this is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. All these words we've read in this podcast, John, Judah is the one that I stumbled over.
Yes, indeed. Yes, even I wouldn't stumble over that, David. Come on, man.
And this is what he saw. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples." And then this bit will sound very familiar to people. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. I mean, Beautiful. So that's huge prophetic language. I mean, it's chapter 2 of Isaiah. It's massive for Israel's theology for Jewish theology. And I think that when Paul says, it is because of the hope of Israel that I'm bound with this chain, there are definitely other texts in mind, but a text like that can't be far from Paul's mind. I don't think he's not scrambling for one random verse that he's kind of reading in a strange way. The core of what it is to be Israel is ultimately the hope that all people will come to God through them. And so, I mean, and please weigh in if you think I'm off base on this here, but so when Paul's saying the hope of Israel, that's the vision that he's thinking about. Yes. That's the prophetic idea that allows him to say, with hand-on-heart integrity, what I'm doing here is absolutely aligned with what we believe as the people of God.
Yeah, completely. I mean, no, I wouldn't push back on any of that. I absolutely would hold to that and believe that. And I think that is all that Jesus came to do and fulfill. Mm-hmm. And I think what Luke has done brilliantly in the book of Acts is, although clearly we see an exciting and inspirational inclusion of the Gentile world. It's not at the expense of, it's not meant to be at the expense of. It's meant to be ultimately through Messiah Jesus. It's meant to be because of Israel. Yes. Israel, forgive this language, please forgive this language. Israel should be sort of taking some of the credit of this because it's ultimately the glory of God. I know it, you know what I mean. But what I mean is, if they properly understand who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to accomplish, then actually many of the glorious prophetic statements of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord covering the earth as the waters cover the sea. I mean, we are seeing many of those ideas literally fulfilled in front of our eyes. We're seeing through the ecclesia, through what should have been and should be this new man, this new person, this Jew and Gentile together in Messiah. And Paul sees that vision. I think that comes across powerfully and dynamically in his writing in Romans. I mean, 9, 10, and 11 of Romans are, I mean, incredible. I think if we want to have a proper sense of our response to understanding of Israel, we cannot ignore those 3 chapters. I mean, they are absolutely formational in an understanding of this language, the hope of Israel. And I know other things can skew the Israel conversation, and we have to be very, very careful for everybody's sake. But actually, we cannot engage in any serious manner with Jesus and with a true understanding of ecclesia without grappling with Israel and without grappling and understanding Israel's role in that whole conversation.
Yeah, and I think for me, those are, that's a key point. So I would love our listeners hold on to that point. I think this phrase, the hope of Israel, and hopefully even just a sample text from Isaiah as an example, the idea of God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament, you can't hold to that because of the statement that Paul makes here.
Absolutely.
The other thing, I think it's implicit in what we're saying, but again, I've heard it preached that, Israel was particular, Old Testament's particularly just about Israel, and it becomes for everybody in the New Testament. But again, a cursory reading of Isaiah, and you realize, nope, the Old Testament, the vision, the focus, the hope was always that all the peoples of the world would come to this God. So I mean, I want to say this with this absolute much respect as is achievable. It's that Jesus doesn't change any of that. Right? No, and that's not to diminish Jesus. That's to actually increase what we're saying of Jesus, that this whole story is being fulfilled in him.
Yeah.
And I do think it's just deeply damaging to us as Christians if we think that God's the kind of God that starts something, scraps it when it's not going very well, and starts again. And sometimes that's how we talk about the Old and New Testament, isn't it?
Absolutely. That would make me slightly nervous as a Gentile coming into this conversation. Well, hold on a minute. You kicked out your firstborn. and that's supposed to make me feel comfortable as an adopted son.
Yes.
So you know, the idea that God has abandoned or would abandon.
Yes.
And look, a cursory reading of Tanakh, it shows the relentless commitment of God to his people, the relentless commitment of God to covenant, the relentless commitment of God to loving kindness, his relentless commitment to try and get this people to be who they were meant to be. And famously, you know, Moses describes them, and they describe themselves as a stiff-necked people. And I think that is one of the traits of that world. And I think you see that thread running all the way through. Paul, of course, himself, before Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, was stiff-necked towards Jesus, Messiah. And it's a revelation that transforms him. But this idea that you've got this brand new missional message, this brand new sort of community message that sort of pops up in Matthew chapter 1 is to absolutely, totally misunderstand. I love Richard Hayes, who's not long passed away, a brilliant New Testament scholar. He has said something like this. He said, we cannot understand the Jewish scriptures without Jesus. And Jesus cannot be understood without the Jewish scriptures. To pull it all together, we need a sort of an unlocking key. This is my summary of his words. And that key is Jesus himself. So actually, Tanakh speaks of Jesus, and we cannot understand the Jesus of the New Testament and what he seeks to accomplish and achieve in the world without Tanakh. So Paul is this part of this first century wave of Jewish believers who totally get Jesus, who totally understand Jesus as the hope of Israel, but totally understand that the hope of Israel doesn't stop at the border of Israel. But the hope of Israel is supposed to go to the nations of the world. And it now, through Messiah Jesus, does go, can go, will go, can I say, is going to the nations of the world right now.
It's so good. It's so good. And then, of course, the last two sentences of our text today, you get one that I find remarkable, where the Jewish people respond to this and say, well, we've not actually received any letters from Judea concerning you. And none of our people have come from there or reported or said anything bad about you. But then they say, but we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect, which I'm not trying to, I find the two things funny, that somehow they've heard about people talking everywhere about this, but they've never heard anything bad about Paul.
It is. It's quite. It is almost a contradiction, isn't it? So what? And of course, this sometimes happens, doesn't it? Like we've all had those experiences where something's happened to us, or we've done something, and it feels like the whole world knows. The whole world's talking about it. You know, the whole world can see it. And actually, we realize nobody's really talking about it, and nobody's really like nobody's noticed. But of course, when you're in the epicenter of it, Paul's probably on that ship thinking, oh my goodness, I'll get to Rome and there will be such a hostile reception for me because they'll send letters to sort of set me up. And I think, again, that puts into context what he's doing here. But the wonderful irony is they're going, no, we haven't got any letters from Judea. Nobody's complaining directly against you. You know, if you want to tell us your story, that's fine. We're not really bothered. However, this sect that you represent, everybody is talking about it, and actually, interesting language, talking against it. So again, it shows again at this gorgeous individual and corporate level. At an individual level, Paul's going, okay, then I'm maybe not as important as I thought I was, because nobody's really talking about me in Jerusalem, in Rome, from the Jewish community. But secondly, this little sect, this 120 people in an upper room in the book of Acts chapter 2, is now making such an impact in the Roman world that everybody, you know, I mean, however you understand that quote, everybody is talking against it. So it it shows again the power of the gospel. The gospel has defied expectation. No one expected this little Jewish sect on the day of Pentecost to survive, let alone thrive. But it is thriving, and in fact, it's thriving to such an extent that they need an explanation from Paul as to what's going on.
Yes, and I was drawn back to Acts 17, where it's like they're turning the world upside down, and here we have,
love that.
Towards the end, like everyone. I mean, the Greek word is quite lovely there. It's quite literally anti-talking.
Yes,
people are anti-talking about this. Which again, of course, is an exaggeration, because the reason people are talking everywhere is that it's growing and the gospel is affecting people and it's shaping people. And I think there's a loveliness in Luke's narrative that he tells us this report, because like we're in Rome. This started, I mean, I know it's 3 years ago for our listeners, but this started just like you said, a handful of people with Jesus. And he said, you will be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And now we hear people everywhere are talking about this. And so in 28 short chapters, in real terms, it's a very short book. We've gone from nobody knows them to now here we are in Rome and everybody's talking about it. So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now. So until next time, from John and I, goodbye.